This poem is entitled Genesis. It's from a collection of poems by Chris Wallace-Crabbe called The Emotions Are Not Skilled Workers. And the title of the collection betrays, how Chris Wallace-Crabbe was feeling when he was writing this collection, and this idea of emotions not being skilled workers. They're not things that are easily controlled. They're not things that are that can be taught. They're uncontrollable, often out of our own hands. And so that's what he's exploring with the broader collection. This particular poem's quite a lengthy poem, Genesis, and the title in and of itself encapsulates one of the dominant Christian cultures in Australia, particularly when Wallace-Crabbe was writing, which is Christianity. It's a poem about religious tradition, and it also interrogates the biblical story that it derives its name from, one of the early stories within the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Christian Bible. So it pulls on quite a lot of different ideas which you need to be aware of before you actually start looking at the poem itself. So if we just make a note of those things to start off with, as I mentioned, the dominant Christian culture here in Australia is what is being captured in this poem, by Wallace-Crabbe. Obviously, over the years, this has changed quite a bit, but if we keep in mind the fact that Wallace-Crabbe has come from a British background, this is clearly something he's going to be very familiar with as an author himself. One of the things that this poem does interrogate is religious tradition. It looks at what is a very well-versed poem, story from the Bible, and really does challenge some of the underpinnings of that story. And so if we were looking at it from a critical perspective, we could argue that it's an interrogation of the biblical story itself. I don't think Chris Wallace-Crabbe aims to undermine it in any way or try to critique it. He's more just questioning the story itself. And you see some of those questions pop up throughout the actual course of the poem. Genesis, the word itself, sort of implies birth or conception. It is, as I mentioned, the first book from the Christian Bible. So he's pulling or drawing on established known entities. There's intertextuality here. When we look at this poem, we need to be considering it within or through the lens of what we already understand this section of the Bible to be about and to mean. One of the really interesting things that he looks at, though, is why, in this particular instance, the Bible chooses to make the female in the storyline, Eve, the villain. That's one of the things that he's looking at with this particular poem, and we'll get started with that now. Now, immediately he commences the poem quite quickly with the subject. So unlike the original, which begins with a focus on Adam, he jumps straight to the heart of the original sin, if you like, which is when Eve picked the apple and succumbed to the temptation of the devil. Right, so from the perspective of the subject, in terms of how he's decided to start, An interesting spot to start this type of poem. So let's go through and see how he structures this first stanza. Then Eve picked the apple, and taking a good bite, learned the first lesson of humanity, which is knowledge, pain, and loss. So that Adam, following after, but out of the seeds of love, took an apple to eat, becoming in this our first father of labour, sweat, and face. To labour, sweat, and face darkness, welling like a spring tide in narrow straits. This darkness that he's referring to, correlates with sin, correlates with the hardships of life. The reality of the world outside of paradise. And so he jumps quite firmly into the storyline, right to the heart of it. And we see that term repeated quite a bit. This repetition continues. So darkness in sun blaze. Then a whole garden transfigured to the serpent's glittering delight. Look at the fruits, prolific, dangling in mass and tone, blush on the peach soft cheek. Cherries like gems, oranges burning, secs of the pomegranate cracked wide open, swelling in fig and pear. That whole estate was suddenly filled with new discriminations, with choices to be plucked. And so what we're seeing here, this transfiguration that's occurring, is this shattering of that innocence that they once held. Right? The beauty and the innocence of that world, that paradise, the Garden of Eden, that's all gone for these two characters. Interestingly, he focuses in on, these new discriminations and these new choices to be plucked. Right? That idea of free will is what ultimately came upon Eve and Adam. And he brings it to the fore really closely here with this repetition that we see towards the end of this particular verse, highlighting both of those things, discriminations and choices. And traditionally, discriminations carries with it that negative connotation, right? And certainly in the modern world, we understand discrimination to be far more than just choice, but that distinct delineation between groups of people. And, he uses this verb here, to be plucked. So carrying on that idea of the fruit, but extending out into the rest of the world, the rest of reality for these two characters. This next verse, and certainly the next 2-3 verses, are different in tone. He's set the scene, and now he commences a bit of an interrogation on the character of Adam. Really starts to focus his attention on Adam, rather than what is traditionally explored, I guess, in terms of interpretations with regards to Genesis in this particular story, which is the weakness and the fallibility of the female character, Eve. Instead, Chris Wallace-Crabbe looks at Adam's character and really challenges his character. He says, "Why was Adam bitterly weak, reproaching God and woman like a spoiled child with broken toys, snivelling and whinging? Why were his guts weak when he was called on to make a stand in this brash new medium, fast-flowing time?" So we've got a clear interrogation here taking place, which is an interesting adaptation, if you like, of this story, this well-known story, to really focus the attention on Adam instead. And this continues as these next few verses progress. If you think about it, the imagery here, the spoilt child snivelling and whinging, all right? Not to mention the guts, the weak guts. It really does convey or present an image of somebody very fragile, very weak. He appears to be the more fallible creature here at this point in time. And that morality of the moment is really challenged in the beginning of the next verse. Wallace-Crabbe writes, "It only took courage." So the end stopping here makes this statement quite blunt. And the fact that he's saying it only took courage suggests that Adam had none. "Be a man," said Eve. "Be a man," said ambiguous God. Yet Adam snuck away and moped like a poor put-upon creep in the shrubbery in the evening, scared of the too much light. Know yourself, Adam. So a few different things that are going on here. This idea that he needs to face the consequences of his decisions is one of the messages that's coming across in this particular poem. Don't hide in the shrubbery. Don't hide behind others. But also, in a sense, if you consider the context of this entire poem, don't hide behind religion either. He's saying that individuals need to own their choices, they need to own their mistakes. This imagery over here, in the evening, too much light, know yourself, links very closely with some of the other poems that we see in this collection that deal directly with light and darkness, and this idea of the harsh reality of the world coming out in the middle of the day, but also that people have different versions of themselves or different opinions of themselves in either the light or in the dark. It's coming back to that same sort of idea that's being played with Chris Wallace-Crabbe's writing. And so here, he's hiding away in the dark because of the too much light would show his true self. This idea of knowing himself. It's a big existential question that comes up in quite a bit of Chris Wallace-Crabbe's writing. He continues on with this criticism, with this interrogation. Why was Adam bitterly weak? With her love, their sweep of knowledge, work to be done all over the face of the earth. So again, this interrogation. Everything was possible that you could hurl in death's teeth. The agricultural revolution slept in ungathered grain. Here, it's almost as if Wallace-Crabbe is jumping forwards in time, looking forward to all of the different elements of progress that were made thereafter this Genesis. Okay, we've got this nod here to modernity, to progress. Not something to be feared. Not something to be feared at all. It's a very reasoned argument that's being made here towards the end of this interrogation. And then he shifts focus. shifts away from Adam and actually starts to look at other elements of this storyline. The serpent was finished, mere reptile. You break the back of the tiger snake as soon as look at him. Farmers hang them on fences. But there was a question for Adam to ask. Why on earth had Eden's God chosen to make the serpent subtle, crammed its jaws with language of men, a trick to cap all creation? Who was kidding whom? So in this verse, to begin with, we get this very brief allusion to Australian imagery. The tiger snake, one of the very common snakes that are found. But he makes this really interesting observation of the snake that, you break the back of the snake and that farmers hang them on fences, in essence trying to diminish the power of the snake and what it represents. Coming back to that idea from a bit earlier that you can't blame the choices that have been made on others or on evil or on the devil. Here he's just saying it's just a snake. This second half of the verse is probably the more interesting one because it highlights, for Chris Wallace-Crabbe anyways, what he sees as a little bit of a paradox of religion. How, if it was God's intention to keep these two pure and to have them living in paradise, why on earth would he create the serpent? Why would he gift it with the ability to be able to speak with the language of men? A trick to cap all creation. Here, the impression is that God himself almost facilitates the sin. So it's an interesting, humorous look at the storyline. Who was kidding whom? He finds, not to diminish the idea of good and evil or religion, but he's just questioning of it. And it in a sense, encapsulates the questioning that the author himself has of religion. And certainly in a largely secular country like Australia, that's something that many people question. So he's trying to capture that questioning a little bit in his writing here. The last section is one continuous verse that he ends with, so quite lengthy. And again, like many of the poems in the collection, the author comes back. He re-enters the poem himself and gives us his feelings or insight into the way that the poem and the story in a broader sense has progressed. I hate the story and love it, detesting death, a vast stupidity, but glorying that Eden could be smeared with, flashing with, energized by the first colours of love. Everything came alive. The dull, stuffy Paradise Park, that silly supermarket, frozen away under Claude Lorraine's stiff glazes, became part of the world. Here, a fresh wind tossed the branches, rotten fruit fell, green fruit waited. Ripeness was all transient, as man's quick breath. Things mattered, and love, anxious love, rose and put forth its flags. So quite a lot of things evoked here in the ending, but overwhelmingly a really interesting and again hopeful ending to Wallace-Crabbe's poem. Again, very similar trope to some of the other ones that we've looked at as well. This particular poem also ends that way. So in spite of his criticisms and the interrogations and the questioning that he had earlier on in the play, he still chooses to end in a hopeful manner, interpreting this poem and, in a broader sense, the story of Genesis and Adam and Eve, not as the loss of something, but the beginning of something. And that's probably, in a sense, why he both hates and loves the story. He detests death, but glories in everything else that came from this particular story itself. You can see here when he puts very short phrases into the middle of the verse. Again, the end stopping. Everything came alive by the first colours of love. This idea, this celebration, is brought to the fore in this concluding verse. It's a really positive, if you think about it, outlook on humanity and on the story in a broader sense. Some of the other references that he has included in here are, Claude Lorraine's stiff glazes, which became part of the world. So Claude Lorraine was a French painter from the 18th century, very well known for painting landscapes. Landscapes that, one could akin to paradise, where Adam and Eve were before their fall. And he essentially highlights how this idea of paradise became a reality. And rather than reading the end, the storyline from the Bible as the end of innocence, he presents it as the beginning of life. He presents it as progress being made, the silly supermarkets, the fresh wind that tossed the branches, the rotten fruit fell. It was all transient, but things mattered, and love, anxious love, rose and put forth its flags. And so this idea of love conquering at the end gives this that hopeful tone, which sits in quite sharp contrast to some of the other parts of the poem. But as I mentioned, it concludes it in a way that reinterprets the biblical story as being the beginning of life rather than the end of innocence. And so that is the poem Genesis by Chris Wallace-Crabbe.